Rome was not built in a day, but in the year 68, it nearly choked on its own blood in a single afternoon. The golden statue of Nero, once towering over the city like a sunburned god, did not gently tip over. It was smashed, pulverized into dust by the very mob that once cheered for his poetry. Deep in a suburban villa miles away from the applause he craved, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty held a dagger to his throat. His hand shook violently, not from fear of the afterlife, but from the sheer indignity of it all. He had dreamed of dying on stage, bathed in roses, but here he was, hiding in a servant's quarters, listening to the galloping hooves of the approaching cavalry sent by the Senate to drag him to the Forum and beat him to death with sticks. What an artist! The world is losing, Nero whimpered, uttering perhaps the most delusional last words in human history, and then only with the help of a freedman. Because he lacked the spine to drive the blade home himself, he severed his jugular. Just like that, the divine bloodline of Julius Caesar and August spilled onto a dirty floor, ending not with a thunderous roar, but with a gurgling whimper. For nearly a century, Rome had convinced itself that only those carrying the blood of gods could wear the purple. They believed the empire was a divine mandate. But as the lifeless body of Nero cooled, wrapped in cheap cloaks, the illusion shattered faster than his marble busts in the city square. The emperor was dead. The audience, however, was not clapping. They were sharpening their knives. The curtain had fallen on the age of gods, and the age of wolves was about to begin. Aristotle once famously claimed that nature abhors a vacuum. He was talking about physics, but the rule applies with even more brutality to politics. When the throne of the Caesars sat empty in the year 68, it did not remain a peaceful void. It became a black hole sucking in ambition, greed, and an ocean of Roman blood. For the first time in 100 years, Rome was not a majestic eagle soaring over the Mediterranean. It was a wounded beast thrashing in the dirt, tearing at its own entrails in a fit of madness. The Senate, a collection of wealthy old men who thought their togas gave them authority, deluded themselves into thinking they were still in charge. They debated and speechified, believing they could elect the next emperor with a show of hands. They were wrong, dead wrong. The center of gravity had shifted, and the heartbeat of the empire was no longer in the marble halls of the Senate House, but in the muddy, frozen camps of the frontier legions. On the banks of the Rhine, in the scorching deserts of Judea and the plains of Spain, hundreds of thousands of armed men looked at their generals and asked a dangerous question. Why should we take orders from a Senate that has never held a sword when we are the ones holding the world together? The historian Tacitus, writing with his signature cynicism, revealed the terrifying truth of this era. He wrote that the secret of the empire was discovered, that emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome. The veil was lifted. The monopoly of the capital was broken. The crown was no longer a divine gift passed down by blood. It was a prize to be seized by whoever had the biggest army and the fewest morals. Into this political meat grinder stepped a family that looked less like Olympian gods and more like the people who fixed your plumbing. They were the Flavians. They had no divine ancestors, no myths, no glamour. What they had was a grandfather who was a tax collector and a father who traded mules. First, there was Vespasian, a 60-year-old general with a bald head, a square jaw, and the permanent expression of a man trying to read a dinner bill in the dark. He was the pragmatic godfather, a man who saw the empire not as a stage for art, but as a business that was failing. He was the anti-Nero. While Nero sang songs, Vespasian counted coins and cleaned stables. Then there was his eldest son, Titus, the golden boy, the conqueror of Jerusalem. He had the charisma of a movie star and the ruthlessness of a serial killer. He was the tragic hero who would try to wash the blood off his hands with benevolence, only to face the wrath of nature itself, and lurking in the shadows was the younger brother to mission, the spare heir, the lonely tyrant. While his father and brother fought wars, he sat in Rome watching, learning, and feeding a paranoia that would eventually turn the palace into a house of mirrors and knives. How did a family of mule breeders from the countryside manage to seize the ultimate prize? How did they drag Rome out of the ashes of civil war and build the Colosseum, the most enduring symbol of Roman power, using nothing but Jewish gold and common sense? The answer lies not in the heavens, but in the mud. Because when the gods stopped answering Rome's prayers, the Flavians were the only ones willing to pick up a shovel. When the dust of Nero's suicide settled, Rome looked up, hoping for a savior. What they got instead was a 70-year-old man with arthritic hands, a face like a dried apple, and a wallet that was welded shut. His name was Severe Sulpicius Galba. If Nero was a never-ending rave party that burned the house down, Galba was the grumpy landlord who showed up the next morning to turn off the electricity and lecture everyone about the noise. He came from an ancient aristocratic family, the kind of lineage that predated the empire itself. He was stern, disciplined, and utterly obsolete. Galba marched into Rome in October of the year 68, and the temperature of the city seemed to drop 10 degrees. He suffered from severe gout. His hands and feet so crippled that he could not even wear shoes or hold a scroll. But his physical frailty was nothing compared to the rigidity of his mind. He believed he was living in the days of the old republic, where virtue was its own reward and soldiers fought for honor. He was about to find out that in the 1st century, soldiers fought for cash. The Praetorian Guard, the elite unit tasked with protecting the emperor, had betrayed Nero because they were promised a massive bribe known as a donate. It was a sum so large, 30,000 sesterces per man, that it could have bought a small farm. When Galba took the throne, the guards extended their hands, expecting their payout. Galba looked at them with the disdain of a strict grandfather and uttered a sentence that would become his epitaph. "I choose my soldiers," he snarled. "I do not buy them." It was a magnificent moral statement. It was noble, it was principled, and politically it was suicide. In the cutthroat world of Roman politics, refusing to pay the men who hold swords to your neck is not a bold management strategy. It is a very complicated way of asking to be murdered. Galba did not stop there. He launched a campaign of austerity that bordered on the absurd. He executed men without trial. He ignored the populace, refusing to host the gladiator games they craved. To the people of Rome, he was not a wise elder. He was a stingy, cruel miser who was sucking the joy out of the city. The atmosphere in Rome curdled. The legions on the Rhine River, disgusted by Galba's weakness and lack of generosity, refused to renew their oaths of loyalty. They toppled his statues. The writing was on the wall. But Galba, blind with arrogance, thought he could solve the crisis by adopting an heir. He chose a young aristocrat named Piso, a man as dull and severe as himself. This was the final straw for a man named Otho had been one of Nero's best friends, a playboy, who had expected to be named the heir. Scorned and furious, Otho realized that if Galba wouldn't pay the guards, he would. It didn't take much. Otho bought the loyalty of the most powerful military unit in the world for a fraction of what they had originally demanded. It turns out when you are starving, you will take a discount on treason. On the morning of January 15th, in the year 69, the trap was sprung. Galba was offering a sacrifice to the gods when rumors swept through the forum that Otho had seized the camp of the Praetorian Guard. Confused and terrified, Galba was advised to barricade himself in the palace. Instead, swayed by false reports that the rebels had been crushed, he climbed into his litter, a sedan chair carried by slaves, and ordered them to carry him into the forum to reassert his authority. It was a lamb walking willingly into a slaughterhouse. As Galba's litter reached the center of the Roman Forum near the basin of Curtius, the crowd suddenly vanished. The streets emptied, and then the thundering of boots echoed off the marble temples. The Praetorian cavalry charged in, not to salute their emperor, but to hunt him. The standard-bearer of Galba's own escort ripped the emperor's image from his staff and threw it into the dirt. The message was clear: "You are fired." Galba was dumped out of his chair. He tumbled onto the hard stones, a helpless old man in a tunic. According to the historian Tacitus, in his final moments, Galba bared his throat to the assassins. "Strike!" he shouted, "if it is for the good of the Roman people." Or perhaps he just screamed for mercy. It didn't matter. A soldier named Camurius drove a sword into his throat. The rest of the frenzied pack hacked at his legs and arms, for his torso was protected by armor. They butchered him like livestock in the middle of the city's most sacred square. A soldier cut off Galba's head, but because the head was bald, the soldier couldn't grab it by the hair. So, in a display of grotesque pragmatism, he stuck his thumb into the mouth of the severed head and carried it to Otho, presenting it like a trophy. Later the head was impaled on a lance, paraded around the camp, and eventually sold to a freedman who threw it onto a tomb near the execution grounds. Galba had ruled for 7 months. He serves as a grim lesson in human resources for every dictator who followed. You can be cruel, or you can be cheap, but you cannot be both. The historian Tacitus left us the most savage burn in history to summarize Galba's life. Capere nisi imperi. He would have been seen as capable of ruling had he never ruled. If Galba was a walking corpse from the austere past, his successor Marcus Salvus O was a creature entirely of the present. He was 36 years old, but he spent more time on his morning routine than most generals spent planning a campaign. Historical records describe him as a man obsessed with his appearance to a pathological degree. He plucked every hair from his body, wore a wig so perfectly crafted that no one could tell he was bald, and applied a face mask made of moist bread every day to prevent wrinkles. He was the metrosexual of antiquity, a man who had once been Nero's best friend and drinking partner until Nero decided to steal his wife, the beautiful Poia Sabina. Did not seize the throne through military genius or divine right. He bought it. It was a transaction, pure and simple. He looked at the disgruntled Praetorian Guard, showed them the gold coins that Galba was too stingy to part with, and essentially said, "Make me emperor, and the drinks are on me." On the 15th of January in the year 69, stepped over Galba's headless corpse and ascended the Palatine Hill. For a moment, it seemed like the bad old days of Nero were back. The people for P are at a return to debauchery. Even allowed himself to be hailed as Nero by the mob. But beneath the layers of perfume and the perfectly coiffed wig, was surprisingly competent. He wanted to rule well. He wanted to bring stability. Unfortunately, in the year 69, stability was a luxury no one could afford. While O was busy redecorating the palace, a storm was brewing in the north. The legions on the Rhine had already declared their own commander, a gluttonous general named Vitellius, as emperor. A massive army, hardened by frontier warfare, was marching toward Italy. Tried to negotiate. He offered to share power. He even offered to marry Vitellius's daughter, but the war machine had already started, and it could not be stopped with a wedding invitation. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. It was a disaster for O. His forces were brave, but they were outmaneuvered by the seasoned veterans of the Rhine. When news of the defeat reached O's camp, his soldiers urged him to fight on. They were willing to die for him. The Praetorian Guard, fierce and loyal, swore they could turn the tide. The civil war could have dragged on for months, perhaps years, turning Italy into a graveyard. And this is where the dandy, the playboy, the man who wore bread on his face, did something that shocked the world. He decided to say no. On the evening of April 16th, O gathered his friends and family. He did not scream or rage. He spoke with a calm dignity that silenced the room. He told them that a prolonged civil war would destroy the Roman state. He said, "It is far more just to perish one for all than many for one." He spent the evening burning his personal letters to protect his friends from the wrath of Vitellius. He distributed money to his servants. He comforted his weeping nephew. Then he retired to his bedroom. He placed 2 daggers under his pillow and fell into a deep sound sleep. The historians note with amazement that his snores were heard through the closed door. At dawn, woke up. He took one of the daggers and with a single steady thrust drove it into his heart. He died as he had lived, with a sense of dramatic timing, but with a newfound courage that redeemed his entire frivolous life. He had ruled for only 3 months. His funeral was held immediately, as he had requested, so that his enemies could not cut off his head and parade it around on a stick like they had done to Galba. The soldiers who carried his body kissed his hands and feet, weeping uncontrollably. Some of them, overcome with grief and admiration for their leader's sacrifice, killed themselves on his funeral pyre. The playboy had become a martyr. Proved that you can live like a joke, but if you die with honor, history might just forgive you. With dead, the throne of the Caesars was once again vacant, waiting for the next contestant in this bloody game of musical chairs, and the man who sat down was so large he might have needed 2 chairs. His name was Vitellius, and if history remembers Galba for his wallet and for his mirror, it remembers Vitellius for his stomach. Vitellius was not a warrior, he was a digestive tract with legs. When the wry legs proclaimed him emperor, It wasn't because they respected his strategic genius. It was because he was weak, pliable, and let them do whatever they wanted. As his army marched toward Rome, leaving a trail of looted villages and empty wine cellars in their wake, Vitellius followed behind in a carriage, feasting 4 times a day. He entered the capital in July of the year 69. Not like a conquering hero, but like a parade of excess. 60,000 soldiers marched with him, many of them wearing animal skins and looking at the sophisticated citizens of Rome like wolves looking at sheep. But the spectacle of the army palled in comparison to the spectacle of the emperor himself. Vitellius was morbidly obese, with a face flushed red from constant drinking and a belly that spilled over his belt. While the empire was bleeding money and the borders were crumbling, Vitellius declared war on the only enemy he cared about: hunger. He treated the imperial treasury like his personal grocery fund. In just a few short months, he reportedly spent 900 million Caesars on banquets. To put that in perspective, that is enough money to fund the entire Roman army for several years. He didn't just eat, he engaged in culinary architecture. His most infamous creation was a dish he humbly called the Shield of Manova, the protector of the city. It was a massive silver platter, so large that a special kiln had to be built just to cook it. And the ingredients, it was a recipe designed by a madman with unlimited credit. It contained the livers of pikefish, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, the melt of lamprey, and most notoriously the tongues of thousands of flamingos. Imagine the logistics. Fleets of ships were dispatched not to fight enemies, but to hunt birds in North Africa and Spain, just so the emperor could have a specific texture on his palate for 5 seconds. He ate with a frantic desperation, as if he were trying to fill the void of his own insecurity, with exotic meats. And when he was full, he would take an emetic, a drug to induce vomiting, purge his stomach, and start eating all over again. The sewers of Rome ran with the wasted delicacies of the world. While Vitellius was busy decapitating flamingos, his soldiers were busy terrorizing the city. The disciplined legions of the Rhine turned into a chaotic mob. They camped in the sacred temples, turning the holy sites into brothel and latrines. They harassed civilians, started fires, and murdered anyone who looked at them wrong. Rome had become a captive city, held hostage by its own defenders. The administration of the empire ground to a halt. Vitellius was bored by politics. He handed over the reins of government to his 2 favorite generals and a freedman named Asiaticus, who sold positions and favors to the highest bidder. The emperor's schedule was simple: wake up, drink, eat, vomit, eat, watch a gladiator fight, eat, and pass out. He even performed sacrifices to the spirit of Nero, openly admiring the dead tyrant for his ability to throw a party. But while the wine flowed in the Palatine Palace, the world outside was sharpening its knives. Across the Mediterranean, the wind was changing in the scorching heat of the east. There was no wine, no flamingo tongues, and no shade. There was only dust, discipline, and iron. The contrast could not have been more stark. In Rome, Vitellius sat amidst piles of food, his chin dripping with grease, laughing at the jokes of his buffoons. In Judea, Vespasian sat on a simple camp stool, wiping sweat from his brow, listening to the reports of his scouts. Vitellius chose to ignore the reports coming from the east. He didn't want to hear about rebellion. It ruined his appetite. He forbade anyone from mentioning Vespasian's name. He deluded himself into thinking that if he just kept eating, the problem would go away. He was like a man trying to stop a volcano by throwing pastries at it. But reality has a way of crashing the party. The legions of the Danube, sensing the weakness in Rome, declared support for Vespasian. They began to march. They weren't coming for dinner. They were coming for blood. By October of 69, the enemy was on Italian soil. Vitellius, roused from his food coma, finally realized that his shield of Minerva couldn't protect him from a gladius. He panicked. He oscillated between pathetic weeping and drunken bravado. He tried to abdicate, wandering in to the forum, dressed in mourning clothes, offering his dagger to the consul, begging to be allowed to retire to a quiet life. But the mob that he had fed and the soldiers he had spoiled would not let him go. They forced him back to the palace. "You are the emperor," they screamed. "You don't get to quit." Vitellius retreated to his dining room, ordering one last feast, trying to eat away the terror. But the thunder of the approaching legions grew louder than the clatter of his silverware. The glutton's bill was finally due, and he was about to find out that he was the main cause. While Vitellius was drowning in wine and gravy in Rome, the deserts of the east were breeding a very different kind of storm. In the province of Judea, the summer sun beat down on the head of Titus Flavius Vespasianus. He was 60 years old. His skin was leathered by decades of service, and his eyes held the weary patience of a man who had seen every form of human stupidity and survived it. Vespasian was currently engaged in the brutal task of suppressing the Jewish revolt. But as news of the chaos in Rome reached his tent, he paused. He was not a man of impulsive ambition. He was cautious. He was calculating. He was the kind of man who checked the structural integrity of a ladder before he climbed it. Legend has it that his destiny was sealed not by a war council, but by a prisoner. A Jewish rebel leader named Josephus, who had been captured by Vespasian's forces, was brought before the general in chains. Instead of begging for his life, Josephus looked the Roman general in the eye and made a stunning prophecy. He declared that Vespasian should not send him to Nero because Vespasian himself would soon be Caesar. At the time, Vespasian likely laughed it off as the ramblings of a desperate man trying to avoid execution. But as the emperors in Rome began to drop like flies, the prophecy started to look less like mysticism and more like a sound career path. On the 1st of July in the year 69, the legions in Egypt took the initiative and swore allegiance to Vespasian. Within days, the armies of Judea and Syria followed suit. The giant of the east had awoken. Vespasian, ever the pragmatist, secured the grain supply in Egypt, effectively putting a hand around Rome's throat, and sent his forces, led by the aggressive general Antonius Primus, to march on Italy. The collision happened once again at Bedriacum in late October. This was the sequel to the battle that had killed U, but this time the carnage was even worse. The armies of Vitellius and Vespasian clashed in the dead of night. It was a confused, bloody mess fought in the moonlight. At one point, when the moon rose behind the Flavian troops, the Vitellian soldiers, confused by the elongated shadows, misjudged their aim and fired their javelins into the dirt. When the sun finally rose, the legions of the east, who had adopted the Syrian custom of saluting the rising sun, let out a great cheer. The Vitellians, thinking Vespasian's reinforcements had arrived, panicked and broke. The road to Rome was open. What followed was not a liberation. It was an apocalypse. In December of 69, the Flavian troops breached the walls of Rome. Street fighting erupted. The citizens of Rome watched from the rooftops as their city burned, cheering on the combatants as if it were a sport in the arena. The most tragic casualty was the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. The sacred heart of the Roman state, the symbol of its eternity, was set on fire and reduced to ashes. It was the ultimate symbol of Rome's self-destruction. Vitellius, trapped in the palace, was a pathetic figure. As the enemy broke down the gates, the gluttonous emperor tried to escape. He didn't grab a sword, he didn't make a last stand. He grabbed a belt filled with gold coins and ran to the doorkeeper's lodge. He barricaded the door with a bed and a mattress and then hid in the doghouse, or at least a dark corner that smelled like one. The Flavian soldiers dragged him out. They didn't recognize him at first. He was disheveled, filthy, and wry of fear. When they realized they had caught the emperor, the humiliation began. They tied his hands behind his back and put a noose around his neck. A soldier held a sword under his chin to force him to keep his head up, so he couldn't hide his face from the mocking crowd. The mob, who had cheered for his feasts just weeks ago, now threw dung and mud at him. They mocked his immense belly. They called him an incendiary and a glutton. They dragged him to the Gymnian stairs, a place of execution where traitors were strangled and thrown down. In his final moments, amidst the spit and the insults, Vitellius managed to find a single shred of dignity. He looked at a soldier who was mocking him and whispered, "Yet I was once your emperor." It was the truth, and it was the saddest thing anyone could say. The soldiers cut him down with a flurry of blows. He died slowly, painfully, his body a mass of wounds. Then, with grappling hooks, they dragged his massive corpse through the streets and tossed it into the Tiber River. The fish of the Tiber would feast on the man who had feasted on the world. The civil war was over. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius were dead. Rome lay in smoking ruins. The treasury was empty. The temples were burnt. The army was fractured. The people were exhausted. The party was officially over. The lights were on. The music had stopped, and the floor was covered in blood and broken glass. Rome didn't need another hero. It didn't need a poet. It didn't need a glutton. It needed a janitor. And from the east, marching slowly but surely, came the man with the broom. Vespasian was coming to clean up the mess. If you looked at a lineup of the first 12 Caesars, Vespasian would stick out like a sore thumb, or more accurately like a calloused, dirty thumb, in a row of manicured, perfumed fingers. The Julio-Claudian dynasty claimed descent from Venus and Aeneas. Their family tree was a golden wreath of gods and heroes. Vespasian's family tree, on the other hand, looked more like a receipt for a donkey sale. Born in the year 9 in a dusty village called Falacrina, north of Rome, Titus Flavius Vespasianus did not have a single drop of royal blood in his veins. His grandfather Titus Flavius Petro was a debt collector, a profession that has never been popular in any century. His father, Titus Flavius Sabinus, was a tax collector in Asia Minor. History records a statue erected in his father's honor with the inscription to an honest tax collector. This might be the only time in human history that the words honest and tax collector have appeared in the same sentence without being a joke. So, Vespasian was not born into power. He was born into the middle management of the empire. He was the son of bureaucrats and bean counters. He grew up not amidst marble columns and poison conspiracies, but among ledgers, mules, and hard work. In fact, he was often mocked as the muler because he once resorted to trading mules to keep his finances afloat. While Nero was learning to play the lyre, Vespasian was learning the price of hay. He was the original new man, novus homo. He didn't want to be emperor. He didn't even want to be a senator. It was his mother, Vespasia Paula, who had to shame him into entering public life, mocking him for being his brother's footman. Reluctantly, he climbed the political ladder, not with the grace of a gazelle, but with the stubbornness of the mules he sold. He served in Thrace, Crete, and Cyrene. He commanded a legion in Britain, under Claudius, fighting 30 battles and capturing the Isle of Wight. It was unglamorous, muddy, bloody work. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who ate the same hard bread as his troops and marched in the same rain. But the defining moment of his character, and the moment that nearly ended his life, happened not on a battlefield, but in a theater seat in Greece. Around the year 66, the Emperor Nero was on his grand artistic tour, forcing captive audiences to listen to his endless lyre performances. To leave while Nero was singing was treason. To stop clapping was a crime. But Vespasian, a 60-year-old general with zero appreciation for the arts and a very low tolerance for boredom, committed the ultimate sin. He fell asleep. Imagine the scene. The god emperor is hitting a high note. Tears streaming down his face, convinced he is channeling Apollo. And in the front row, Vespasian's head drops, his chin hits his chest, and perhaps a soft snore escapes his lips. The Praetorian guards noticed. The sycophants noticed. Nero noticed. Vespasian was shaken awake by a terrified freedman named Phoebus. The old general, rubbing his eyes, likely asked if the show was over. It wasn't, but his life nearly was. Nero was furious. He banned Vespasian from his presence. When Vespasian, confused and socially awkward, asked Phoebus where he should go if he couldn't go to court, the freedman snapped, "Go to hell," or, more literally, "Go to the Morbovian luck," a slang term for get lost and die. Vespasian, ever the pragmatist, simply asked, "Where is that exactly?" and retired to a small, obscure town to hide, fearing that an execution order would arrive any minute. But this incident revealed the essence of the man. He was incapable of fake flattery. He was dangerously authentic. And ironically, this crime saved him. When the Jewish revolt broke out in 66, Nero needed a general. He couldn't send an young, ambitious, or charismatic, because they might steal the throne. He needed someone boring, someone reliable, someone who was so unrefined he fell asleep at the opera. He remembered Vespasian. Nero thought, here is a man who is too old to be a threat and too uncultured to be a rival. It was the last mistake Nero would ever make regarding personnel management. Thus, Vespasian represents a seismic shift in Roman history. He was the corporate CEO, taking over a family business that had been run into the ground by spoiled heirs. He proved that you didn't need to be born a god to rule the world. You just needed to show up, do the work, and try not to snore too loudly when the boss was talking. Winning a civil war is messy. It involves a lot of stabbing, burning, and screaming. But governing after a civil war, that is boring. And Vespasian loved boring. He was the first emperor to realize that the sword could seize the throne, but only a piece of paper could hold it. He understood that Rome was a society obsessed with the rule of law, even when it was breaking every law imaginable. So, in late 69 or early 70, he pulled off one of the greatest legal magic tricks in history. It was called the Lex Dei Imperio Vespasiani, the law on the power of Vespasian. Before this moment, the powers of the emperor were a vague collection of traditions, military commands, and divine assumptions inherited from the Julio-Claudian bloodline. Augustus had been careful to pretend he wasn't a monarch. Vespasian, however, didn't have time for charades. He had the Senate pass a law that explicitly defined what an emperor could do. This law, inscribed on a massive bronze tablet that you can still see today in the Capitoline museums in Rome, was essentially a retroactive permission slip for dictatorship. It stated that whatever Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius were allowed to do, Vespasian was also owed to do. It gave him the legal right to make treaties, convene the Senate, and interfere in elections. But more importantly, it contained a clause that basically said the emperor can do whatever he thinks is in the public interest. It was a masterstroke. By passing this law, Vespasian turned the position of emperor from a magical birthright into a job description. He wasn't ruling because his grandmother slept with a god. He was ruling because the Senate had hired him for the position of supreme executive officer. He legitimized his coup d'etat by wrapping it in the comforting blanket of bureaucracy. Once he had the legal framework, Vespasian turned his attention to the personnel department, the Senate. The Roman Senate in the year 70 was a sorry sight. It was filled with the remnants of the old aristocracy, men who had survived Nero and the civil wars by being sycophants, cowards, or purely decorative. They were blue bloods who looked down on Vespasian's mule-breeding background. Vespasian in turn looked at them and saw dead weight. In the year 73, Vespasian assumed the ancient office of censor along with his son Titus. The censor had the power to review the roll of the Senate and strike off names for moral failings. Vespasian wielded this power like a scythe. He didn't execute his political enemies. That was the old way, the Nero way, and it was messy. Instead, he simply fired them. He purged the Senate of the old decadent families who spent their time plotting and partying. In their place, he brought in a new breed of men, provincials. He recruited wealthy, hard-working elites from Spain, Gaul, and the Italian municipalities. These were men like himself, pragmatic, loyal, and grateful. They were men who owed their careers to Vespasian, not to their ancestors. By doing this, Vespasian changed the DNA of the Roman ruling class forever. He transformed the Senate from a Roman country club into an imperial governing body that actually represented the empire. He proved that you didn't need to be born on the Palatine Hill to run the world. You just needed to be competent. He cultivated the image of Pater Patri, father of the country. But not the indulgent father who gives you candy. He was the strict father who checked your homework and made you do your chores. He opened the palace doors to the public, not for parties, but for business. He removed the excessive security guards, showing he wasn't afraid of his own people. He was approachable, earthy, and brutally efficient. The Lex de Imperio Vespasiani was the moment the Roman Empire stopped being a family drama and started being a state institution. Vespasian took the crown out of the realm of mythology and bolted it firmly onto the bedrock of Roman law. When Vespasian finally sat on the throne in the year 70, he opened the imperial account books and found something terrifying. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nero had spent it all on golden houses and singing lessons. The civil war had burned the rest. The empire was not just broke, it was in a financial crater so deep you could see the underworld. According to the historian Suetonius, Vespasian announced to the Senate that he needed 40 billion sesterces immediately just to keep the state from collapsing. To put that number in perspective, a Roman legionary earned about 900 sesterces a year. Vespasian needed enough money to pay an army for a 000 years, and he needed it yesterday. So the new emperor did what any desperate CEO would do. He became the most creative, ruthless, and shameless tax collector the world had ever seen. He didn't just cut spending, he declared war on empty pockets. He raised tributes from the provinces. He revoked the tax-exempt status of wealthy cities. He even sold priesthoods and high offices to the highest bidder. But his most genius and cynical method was what he called the sponge strategy. Vespasian would deliberately promote the greediest, most corrupt officials to powerful positions. He would let them steal, bribe, and accumulate massive fortunes, watching them swell up like sponges, soaking up water, and then once they were full, he would accuse them of corruption, arrest them, and squeeze them dry, seizing all their assets for the state treasury. It was a masterclass in gangster economics. Let the thieves do the work, then rob the thieves. However, nothing defines Vespasian's desperate genius, quite like the tax that made him a legend of comedy and pragmatism, the urine tax. In ancient Rome, urine was a valuable industrial commodity. It contains ammonia, a powerful bleaching agent. The laundry workers known as fones used collected urine to bleach togas, keeping them sparkling white. It was also used by tanners to soften leather. For centuries, pots were placed on street corners for passers-by to relieve themselves, and the contents were collected and sold to these industries. It was a dirty, smelly, but essential business. Vespasian looked at these pots of urine and didn't see waste. He seen liquid gold. He imposed a tax on the collection of urine from public latrines. This decision caused a scandal. The aristocracy was horrified. It was one thing to tax land or grain, but to tax human waste, it was seen as beneath the dignity of the emperor. It was gross. It was tacky. The voice of this aristocratic disgust was none other than his own son, Titus. Titus was young, idealistic, and concerned about their public image. He stormed into his father's office, complaining that the urine tax was disgusting and that the people were laughing at them. He argued that the emperor of Rome should not be acting like a latrine attendant. Vespasian listened patiently. He then reached into a bag of coins, the first revenues collected from this new tax. He pulled out a silver denarius, held it up to Titus's nose, and asked him a simple question. "Son, does this smell?" Titus sniffed the metal and shook his head. "No, father, it does not." Vespasian smirked and delivered the punchline that would echo through 2,000 years of history. Atquia luyo est, and yet it comes from urine. From this encounter comes the famous proverb, pecunia non let. Money has no smell. It was the ultimate statement of pragmatism. Gold is gold whether it comes from a temple offering or a public toilet. Vespasian taught Rome a hard lesson. You cannot build an empire on dignity alone. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to keep the marble white. The irony is that Vespasian was so successful at scraping pennies that he became known for his legendary stinginess. Anecdotes about his frugality became the favorite jokes of the Roman public. There is a story that a delegation from a certain city voted to erect a colossal statue of Vespasian, costing 1,000,000 sesterces. When they came to tell him the good news, expecting him to be flattered, Vespasian simply held out his hand, cupped his palm, and said, "Place the money here. The base is ready." He took the cash and cancelled the statue. Another time, while traveling, his mule driver stopped the carriage, claiming the mules needed to be reshored, a process that took suspiciously long. Vespasian realized the driver had actually stopped to allow a petitioner to approach the emperor and ask for a favor. Instead of executing the driver for the deception, Vespasian asked how much the petitioner had paid him for the stop. When the driver confessed, Vespasian demanded half the bribe as his commission. He was mocked in the theaters. Even at his own funeral, the arch-mime Favo, playing the role of the dead emperor, asked the undertakers how much the funeral procession cost. When they told him 10 million sesterces, the actor, staying in character as Vespasian, shouted, "Give me 100,000 and you can just throw me in the Tiber River." Yet behind the jokes and the penny pinching was a profound truth. Vespasian didn't hoard money like a dragon. He spent it, but he spent it on Rome, not on himself. He funded the arts, ironically, for a man who slept through operas. He paid salaries to teachers of rhetoric, the first time the state subsidized education, and he rebuilt the city. Most importantly, That dirty, smelly money from the urine tax paid for the Colosseum, the greatest architectural triumph of the Roman world, a monument that has stood for millennia, was literally financed by the bladder of the Roman people. Vespasian proved that there is no such thing as dirty money if it is used to build something beautiful. He was the only king in history who could look at a bucket of piss and see the foundations of a wonder of the world. Today in Italy and France, public urinals are still named after him, Vespasiani and Vespasianis. It is perhaps a dubious honor, but Vespasian wouldn't mind, as long as they are free to use, or better yet if they turn a profit. If Vespasian's tax policies were the software of his new regime, then the Colosseum was its hardware, massive, indestructible, and built with a very specific purpose: to rewrite the map of Rome and erase the memory of Nero, using 50,000 tons of travertine stone. To understand the genius of the Colosseum, you first have to understand the insanity of what stood there before. After the Great Fire of 64, Nero had seized a massive chunk of downtown Rome, about 200 acres, to build his dream home, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was not just a palace. It was a country estate dropped into the middle of a crowded city. It had vineyards, forests with wild animals, a rotating dining room, and a massie. The artificial lake that Nero claimed was like a sea. For the average Roman living in a cramped, fire-prone apartment, the Domus Aurea was a daily insult. It was a physical manifestation of the emperor saying, "I matter and you don't." When Vespasian took power, he looked at this sprawling private paradise and saw a political landmine. If he lived there, he would just be another tyrant. If he destroyed it without replacing it, he would look like a vandal. So he decided to do something brilliant. He would execute the greatest eminent domain seizure in history. He would take the land back from the emperor and give it back to the people. But he wouldn't give them a park. He would give them a slaughterhouse. Vespasian ordered the Domus Aurea to be dismantled. He filled in Nero's giant artificial lake with tons of earth and rubble. And right on top of where Nero used to float on his pleasure barge, Vespasian laid the foundations for the Amphitheatrum Flavium. The message was loud and clear. Where a tyrant once compelled people to give up their homes for his private enjoyment, a man of the people was now building a public arena for their entertainment. It was the ultimate populist move. He replaced private luxury with public bloodshed. Construction began around the year 72. The scale of the project was mind-boggling. It was the largest amphitheater ever built in the Roman world. But a project of this magnitude required two things that Rome was usually short on: unlimited money and expendable labor. Luckily for Vespasian, his son Titus had just finished destroying Jerusalem. The Colosseum was built on the back of Jewish suffering. The vast treasures looted from the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the gold lampstands, the silver trumpets, the mountains of coin, paid for the stone and the cement, and the workforce. Up to 100,000 Jewish prisoners of war were marched back to Rome in chains. Visualizing the construction site requires imagining an ant colony of human misery and engineering brilliance. For nearly a decade, these slaves toiled under the Roman sun. They dragged giant blocks of travertine from the quarries of Tivoli 20 m away. They mixed the mortar. They operated the cranes. It is a dark irony that the monument we celebrate today as the symbol of Roman civilization was built by the people Rome tried hardest to destroy. From an engineering standpoint, the Colosseum was a miracle of efficiency. It was a triumph of Roman concrete, opus cementitium. Unlike the Greeks who built by stacking stones, the Romans poured liquid stone into molds, and this allowed them to build higher, stronger, and faster. The skeleton of the Colosseum is a vast network of arches and vaults. The arch is the key. An arch distributes weight downwards and outwards, allowing you to stack them on top of each other like a house of cards that never falls. The Colosseum consists of 80 entrance arches on the ground level. This wasn't just for aesthetics, it was for crowd control. The architects designed the building so that 50,000 screaming fans could enter or exit the stadium in under 15 minutes. They called the exits vomitory because the building would literally vomit the people out into the streets. It was crowd management so advanced that modern stadiums still use the same design principles today. Inside, the seating was strictly segregated by class. The senators sat in the front row on marble seats where they could smell the blood. The knights sat behind them. The ordinary citizens sat further up, and at the very top in the nosebleed section on wooden benches sat the women and the slaves. The Colosseum was a microcosm of Roman society. Everyone was together, but everyone knew their place. And then there was the name. Vespasian never called it the Colosseum. To him, it was the Flavian amphitheater. The name Colosseum came later, derived from the Colosseum derived from the Colossus of Nero, a 100 feet tall bronze statue of Nero that stood nearby. In a display of his legendary pragmatism and stinginess, Vespasian didn't melt down the giant statue of the hated Nero. That would have been a waste of good bronze. Instead, he just ordered the head to be replaced. They took off Nero's face and welded on a generic face of the sun god's soul with sun rays spiking out of the head. So the statue stayed, casting its long shadow over the new arena, a headless tyrant guarding the house of the new dynasty. By the time Vespasian died, the structure had reached the 3rd story. He never saw it completed. He never saw a gladiator die on its sands. But he knew what he had achieved. He had turned a private lake into a public ocean of noise. He had cemented the Flavian name into the skyline of Rome. He proved that while Nero could build a house of gold, only a Flavian could build a mountain of stone. By the summer of the year 79, the engine that was Vespasian began to sputter. He was 69 years old, a remarkable age for a Roman emperor, especially considering that most of his predecessors had died from knife wounds rather than natural causes. He had spent 10 years dragging Rome out of the mud, scrubbing the marble clean, and refilling the treasury. The work had been endless, thankless, and exhausting. He retreated to his country villa at Aquae Cotili near his hometown in the Sabine Hills. He sought relief in the cold mineral springs that the region was famous for. But the cold water, which was supposed to cure his stomach ailments, only seemed to freeze his aging guts. He was struck down by a severe case of dysentery. For a man who had spent his life dealing with the figurative excrement of Roman politics, there is a dark poetic justice in the fact that he died dealing with the literal kind. But even as his body failed him, his work ethic remained terrifyingly intact. Bedridden and weak, he continued to receive ambassadors, dictate letters, and audit accounts. He famously said that an emperor should be like a soldier on duty, alert until the very end. It was during these final painful days that Vespasian delivered his greatest line. It was the ultimate dad joke of antiquity, a final flash of the dry, cynical wit that had defined his entire reign. As he felt the life draining out of him, and perhaps as the pain made him delirious, he looked at the weeping attendants and the solemn doctors surrounding his bed. He knew what came next. In Roman tradition, when a popular emperor died, the Senate would vote to deify him, to turn him into a god, to be worshipped in temples. Vespasian, the muleer, the tax collector, the man who knew the price of urine, found the idea of himself as a celestial being absolutely hilarious. He whispered, "Vi puto Dios fio, dear me, I think I am becoming a god." It was a scathing satire of the imperial cult. With his dying breath, he mocked the vanity of Rome. He was essentially saying, "I am an old man himself to death, and you idiots are going to build temples for me." It was the final triumph of reality over delusion. Nero died believing he was an artist. Vespasian died knowing he was just a man. On the 23rd of June, 79, the end came. A sudden wave of diarrhea seized him, nearly causing him to faint. But as the darkness closed in, panic did not set in. Discipline did. Vespasian grabbed the arms of his attendants. He struggled to rise. His legs shook. His breath rattled in his chest. But he forced himself up. He gasped out his final command, not to an army but to himself. Imperator tantum mori, operator to die standing. He wasn't talking about posture. He was talking about dignity. He was a soldier. He was an imperator, a commander. Commanders do not die curled up in the fetal position. They die on their feet facing the enemy. And for Vespasian, the enemy was death itself. With a final gargantuan effort, he straightened his back, locked his knees, and died vertical. He died in the arms of those supporting him, but he died upright. The news of his death did not bring panic to the streets of Rome, as the death of Nero had. Instead, it brought a strange, unfamiliar sensation: stability. Vespasian left behind a legacy that was miraculous. When he took the throne, the state was bankrupt. When he died, the treasury was so full that his successors could afford to build the Colosseum, the Arch of Titus, and throw games that lasted for months. He had taken a demoralized, mutinous army and turned it back into the disciplined machine that conquered Britain and Judea. But his greatest achievement was biological. For the first time in the history of the Roman Empire, after the dynasties of Caesar and Augustus had failed to produce a single direct male heir to succeed them, a father passed the throne to his biological son. Titus succeeded Vespasian smoothly, without a single sword being drawn. There was no civil war, no year of 4 emperors, just a seamless transition of power. The new heir had done what the gods of the Julio-Claudian line could not. He built a stable family business. Vespasian had found Rome, a city of brick and bloodshed, trembling in the aftermath of anarchy. He left it a city of concrete and order, ready for its golden age. He was not the most glamorous emperor. He was not the most handsome, but as his body was prepared for the funeral, even the senators who had mocked his accent had to admit the truth. Rome hadn't needed a god. It had needed a father, and Vespasian, the old, stingy, pragmatic soldier, had been the best father the empire could have asked for. Titus had sat on the throne for exactly 2 months. The laurel wreath was barely settled on his brow. The Senate was still tentatively clapping, and then the gods decided to test the new emperor with the end of the world. It was late summer, likely August or October of the year 79. The Bay of Naples was the playground of the Roman elite, a glittering coastline of marble villas, vineyards, and debauchery. Dominating the skyline was Mount Vuvius. To the locals, it was just a mountain, a harmless green giant where wild bomed and the best grapes in Italy grew. They had no word for volcano in their language. They had forgotten that the earth could vomit fire. On the morning of the 24th, the lid of hell was blown off. It didn't start with lava flowing slowly like honey, as often depicted in bad movies. It started with a deafening boom that shattered eardrums miles away. The mountain literally decapitated itself. A column of ash, pumice and gas shot 20 m into the stratosphere. Across the bay in a 17-year-old boy named Pliny the Younger watched in horror. He later described the cloud as resembling a massive umbrella pine tree, a trunk of smoke rising high into the air and spreading out branches of darkness. But for the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum, it wasn't a botanical curiosity. It was a sealing of death, sealing them in. At noon, the sun vanished. A darkness deeper than any night descended, broken only by the flashes of lightning, generated by the friction of the ash clouds. It was a prehistoric terror in Pompeii. Small stones pumice began to rain down. At first it was annoying, then it was painful, then it was lethal. The stones fell at a rate of 6 per hour. Roofs began to groan under the weight. Doors were blocked. People were trapped in their own homes, buried alive by a sky that had turned into stone. Those who ran into the streets tied pillows to their heads to protect themselves from the falling rocks. They navigated by torchlight in the middle of the day, wading through a gray, choking blizzard. The air smelled of sulfur, the scent of the underworld. But if Pompeii was being buried, Herculaneum was being erased. Around midnight, the column of ash collapsed. This created a pyrolastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas and rock, moving at 100 miles per hour with temperatures reaching nearly 1,000 degrees F. It hit Herculaneum like a sledgehammer. The people hiding in the boats on the beach didn't suffocate. They were instantly vaporized. Their brains boiled inside their skulls. Exploding them, their flesh turned to charcoal in a split second. It was a mercy in a way. They died before their nerves could register the pain. Meanwhile, the most famous casualty of the disaster was sailing toward the danger. Pliny the Elder, the admiral of the fleet, and the most renowned scholar of his age, was at Misenum when the eruption began. His scientific curiosity was greater than his instinct for self-preservation. He famously declared, "Fortune favors the brave," and ordered his galleys to sail across the bay to rescue a friend and to get a closer look at the phenomenon. It was a suicide mission driven by intellectual arrogance. As his ship approached the burning coast, the ash fell so thick it choked the deck. The water was too shallow, blocked by new islands of debris formed by the volcano. Pliny managed to land at Stabi further down the coast. He found his friends in a panic. In a display of stoic Roman calmness, or perhaps sheer madness, Pliny took a bath, ate dinner, and went to sleep while the mountain roared outside. The next morning the air was unbreathable. Pliny, who was overweight and asthmatic, tried to flee to the beach. He collapsed on the sand, gasping for air as the toxic fumes filled his lungs. His slaves abandoned him to save themselves. The great encyclopedist died there, looking like a man sleeping, his notebook likely still in his pocket, killed by the fire. Very nature he had spent his life studying. Back in Rome, the news hit Titus like a physical blow. The Campanian coast, the jewel of the empire, was gone. Thousands were dead. Refugees were streaming north, covered in grey dust, telling stories of fire and demons. This was the moment that would define Titus. Nero had famously fiddled or sang while Rome burned. Titus did the opposite. He didn't hide in the palace. He didn't offer empty prayers. He went to work. He immediately appointed a commission of distinguished former consuls to oversee the relief effort. This was rare, delegating power to capable men rather than keeping it all for himself. Then he did something even rarer. He left Rome and traveled to the disaster zone. Imagine the emperor walking through the grey wasteland that used to be Cana. The dust was still settling. The heat was still radiating from the ground. It was a dangerous, unstable environment. By being there, Titus sent a powerful message. I am not a god sitting on a cloud. I am a man standing in the ash with you. He opened his own wallet. He didn't just use state funds. He sold his own furniture, his own statues, and his own luxury items to raise money for the victims. He organized the construction of new housing for the refugees. There was also a grim pragmatism to his charity. Entire families had been wiped out in Pompeii, leaving no heirs. By law, their property should have gone to the state treasury. Titus refused to take it. Instead, he ordered that the assets of the dead be used to help the survivors. He essentially created a massive disaster relief fund, using the wealth of the victims to save the living. For months, Titus acted more like a frantic aid worker than an emperor. He was exhausted, covered in dust, and heartbroken. The disaster of Vuvius stripped away any remaining arrogance he might have had from his days as a conqueror. He was, seeing the futility of human power. He had destroyed Jerusalem with fire, and now nature was destroying his own land with fire. The tragedy of Pompeii was preserved in time. The ash acted as a preservative, freezing the horror for 2,000 years. We see the dog twisting on its chain. We see the lovers embracing for the last time. We see the man clutching his bag of gold, running from a doom that money couldn't bribe. But for Titus, there was no time to mourn the dead, because while he was in Campa helping the victims, another messenger arrived from Rome with more bad news. The city was on fire again. It seemed the gods were not done with the Flavian dynasty. They were just reloading. In the year 80, while the emperor was still in Campia organizing relief efforts, a second messenger arrived breathless and terrified. Rome was burning again. It had only been 16 years since the great fire of Nero, and the city had barely finished rebuilding. Now flames were once again licking the sky. This fire was not as widespread as Nero's, but it was surgically precise in its destruction. It burned for 3 days and nights, consuming the most sacred structures in the Campus Martius. The Pantheon built by Agrippa was gutted. The theatre of Pompey was damaged, but the most crushing blow was the destruction of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. The irony was suffocating. Vespasian had spent his entire reign rebuilding that specific temple as a symbol of the new era. Now under his son, it was a smoking ruin. It was as if the heavens were rejecting the Flavian restoration. Titus raced back to Rome, famously crying when he saw the devastation, exclaiming, "This is my personal ruin." But fire was clean compared to what came next. From the ashes rose a pestilence, a virulent plague, sweeping through the crowded slums of Rome. It was likely exacerbated by the refugees. From the fire and the volcano huddled together in unsanitary camps, the historian Suetonius describes it as a pestilence of the worst kind. Thousands died daily. The carts that used to carry grain now carried corpses. The smell of death in Rome reviled the smell of sulfur in Pompeii. Amidst this biblical sequence of disasters, volcano, fire, plague, a dark whisper began to circulate through the back alleys of the empire. It started in the Jewish communities and spread to the superstitious Romans. Was this the curse of Jerusalem? 10 years earlier, Titus had burned the house of God in Jerusalem. He had stolen the sacred menorah and the holy vessels. He had slaughtered the chosen people. Now the Jewish mystics claimed the God of Israel was collecting the debt. You burned my temple. I will burn yours. You suffocated my people. I will suffocate yours with ash and disease. Even the Romans who worshipped different gods began to wonder if Titus was cursed. The timing was too perfect. The disasters were too elemental. It felt like a cosmic balancing of the scales. Titus, the man who wanted to be the delight of the human race, was presiding over the suffering of the human race. Desperate to break the curse and lift the gloom that hung over the city like a shroud, Titus did the only thing a Roman emperor knew how to do. When things got bad, he announced a party so big, so bloody, and so spectacular that it would make the people forget the wrath of the gods. In the year 80, Titus played his final card, with the smell of the great fire still lingering in the streets and the cough of the plague echoing in the alleys. He announced the completion of his father's great project. The Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, was open for business to wipe the misery from the minds of the mob. Titus didn't just throw a party, he threw a 100-day massacre for 100 consecutive days, from dawn until dusk. The roar of the crowd drowned out the sorrows of the city. The scale of the slaughter was industrial. Historical records claim that 9,000 wild animals were killed during the inaugural games. The ecological impact was so severe that lions disappeared from Mesopotamia and elephants vanished from North Africa. Rome was literally eating the natural world alive for entertainment. The spectacles were designed to shock. One day, the arena would be filled with cranes fighting against wolves, a grotesque comedy. The next 4 elephants would fight each other, but the pièce de résistance, the moment that made the Roman jaw drop, was the Nakia, the mock naval battle. Using a complex system of aqueducts and slagets, the engineers of Titus flooded the arena floor. In a matter of hours, the dusty fighting pit was transformed into a lake. Full-sized warships were floated in. Real sailors and marines, condemned criminals, fought to the death on the water while horses and bulls were trained to swim among the wreckage. It was a technical impossibility made real. It was Titus saying to the people, "Look what I can do. I can bring the ocean to the city. I can control the elements, so stop worrying about the volcano." But amidst the cheering and the bloodlust, a dark paradox sat in the imperial box. Titus, the master of ceremonies, the godlike provider of this feast, was dying. Observers noted that the emperor looked pale, bloated, and perpetually sad. He would often burst into tears in public during the games, overcome by a mysterious melancholia. While 50,000 people screamed for blood, Titus sat wrapped in his purple toga, shivering. He was throwing wooden balls into the crowd, tokens redeemable for prizes like food, clothing, slaves, and gold, with the frantic energy of a man trying to buy his way into heaven. The contrast was heartbreakingly cinematic. Below him, gladiators in golden armor saluted him, a imperator morator salutant. "Hail, Emperor! Those who are about to die salute you." But in reality, it was the emperor who was about to die. The Colosseum was not just a building. It was a machine designed to convert death into political loyalty, and Titus was feeding it everything he had. The animals, the criminals, the gold, and finally his own life force. The inauguration was the most magnificent festival Rome had ever seen, but it felt less like a celebration and more like a very loud, very expensive wake for a man who knew his time was up. The tragedy of Titus is not just that he died young. It is that he died just as he was becoming the hero Rome desperately needed. In September of the year 81, barely 2 years into his reign, the emperor fell ill. By a cruel twist of fate, he was traveling to the same Sabine villa where his father had died. He was laid in the same bed under the same roof to face the same darkness. As the fever consumed him, Titus pulled back the curtains of his litter and gazed at the sky, lamenting that life was being taken from him unjustly. He whispered that in his entire life he had only one regret, "Iuan tantum." He never said what it was. Was it his affair with Bones? Was it the destruction of the temple? Or, as many historians suspect, was his one regret that he hadn't killed his brother Decian when he had the chance? The shadow of Domitian looms large over Titus's deathbed. Ancient sources, always eager for a scandal, suggest foul play. Some say Domitian poisoned his brother's food. Others claim a more passive yet equally lethal form of murder. that Domitian ordered the doctors to place the feverish Titus in a bath packed with snow, ostensibly to cool him down, but in reality to freeze the life out of him. On the 13th of September 81, Titus died. He was 41 years old. The reaction of the Roman people was historical. The Senate, usually so cynical, poured into the streets to mourn. They eulogized him as if they had lost a father. He was the comet that burned too bright and faded too fast. But while Rome wept, Domitian didn't waste a second. He didn't even wait for the body to get cold. He rode straight to the Praetorian camp to be hailed as emperor, leaving his brother's corpse behind like forgotten luggage. The good emperor was dead. The bad brother had won, and Rome was about to find out that while Titus had tried to buy their love with games, Domitian would demand their obedience with blood. To understand the monster that Domitian became, you have to look at the lonely boy he was. History is written by the victors, and since the Senate hated Domitian, they painted him as a born psychopath. But if we look closer, we see something more tragic. The classic case of the spare air syndrome. While Vespasian and Titus were out in the world commanding legions, conquering Britain, and burning Jerusalem, young Domitian was left behind in Rome. He was essentially the luggage the family forgot at the airport. He grew up in a modest house on Pomegranate Street, without a mother, who had died young, and without a father figure. During the year of the 4 emperors, while his father was becoming a hero in the East, Domitian was hiding in the closets of Rome, dodging the assassins of Vitellius. There is a famous story that during the burning of the capital, the 18-year-old Domitian only escaped death by disguising himself as a priest of the goddess Isis, shaving his head and slipping out with the refugees. Imagine the psychological scar. While his brother was riding a white horse as a conqueror, Domitian was hiding in a linen skirt, shaking with fear. When Vespasian finally arrived in Rome, Domitian expected a hero's welcome. He rushed to greet his father, hoping for praise, hoping to final be included in the family business. Instead, Vespasian looked at him with the cold eyes of a pragmatic general and essentially told him, "Go to your room." Vespasian did not trust Domitian. He gave him titles, but no power. He treated him like a child. Titus, the golden boy, always stood between them, blocking the light. Domitian was forced to walk behind his father and brother in every triumph, literally living in their shadow. He developed a festering inferiority complex that would rot his soul. He was the smart, awkward, introverted kid who sat in the corner at parties watching everyone else have fun, making a mental list of all the people he would punish when he was in charge. And he had peculiar hobbies. The historian Suetonius tells us that in the early years of his reign, Domitian would spend hours alone in his room, doing nothing but catching flies and stabbing them with a sharp stylus. When a visitor asked the guard if anyone was in there with the Caesar, the guard wittily replied, "No musca quidem," not even a fly. This image of the Emperor of Rome sitting alone in the dark, meticulously impaling insects, is both hilarious and terrifying. It shows a man who craved control over even the smallest, most insignificant things. It shows a man who preferred the company of dead flies to living senators. When Titus died in 81, the mask finally fell off. Domitian did not possess the rough charm of his father. He did not have the easy smile of his brother. He was balding, pot-bellied, and had a face that was perpetually red, as if he were blushing or suppressing a scream. He hated crowds, he hated noise, he hated the messy, chaotic reality of human interaction. He decided that if he could not be loved like Titus, he would be worshipped like a god. He rejected the humble title of first citizen, princes that Augustus had created to pretend the republic still existed, Domi, and had no time for pretending. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus Eidos, Lord and God, and this was a shocking breach of Roman protocol. It was the title of a slave master, not a political leader. He was telling the Senate, "I am not your equal, I am your owner." He began to dress in the purple robes of a triumphant general every day. He renamed the months of September and October after himself, Germanicus and Duitianus, though thankfully those names didn't stick. He was the first emperor who didn't try to hide the autocracy. He looked at the Roman aristocracy and saw a collection of hypocrites and dinosaurs. He decided to rule alone from behind the high walls of his palace, surrounded by mirrors and spies. The abandoned son had finally taken the keys to the house, and he was locking everyone else out. The era of the good Flavians was over. The era of the schoolmaster of Rome had begun, and he had a very heavy ruler ready to rap the knuckles of anyone who stepped out of line. If Domitian were alive today, he would not be a politician. He would be the terrifying auditor of a massive corporation who stays late to check if you stole a stapler. History has called him a tyrant, and he was. But he was a very specific kind of tyrant. He wasn't a chaotic madman like Caligula, who declared war on the ocean. He was a bureaucratic, obsessive, compulsive, who declared war on the ocean. Domitian was the ultimate micromanager. He trusted no one. He believed that if you wanted a job done right, you had to do it yourself, even if that job was running an empire spanning 3 continents. When he looked at the Roman economy, he didn't see a majestic system. He saw a leaky bucket. Governors were stealing taxes, judges were taking bribes, the currency was losing value. So, Domitian rolled up his purple sleeves and went to work. His first target was the currency itself. For decades, as emperors like Nero had been slowly debasing the silver denarius, mixing in cheap copper to save money. It was the ancient equivalent of printing money to cause inflation. Domitian, appalled by this lack of standards, did the unthinkable. He actually increased the silver content of the coin. Around the year 85, he raised the purity of the denarius from roughly 90% to nearly 98% silver. It was a massive flex of economic muscle. He was telling the world, "My Rome is real, my money is real." Under his reign, the Roman currency reached a standard of value it would never see again. It was the gold standard or silver standard of the ancient world. But a strong currency is useless if your employees are robbing you. Domitian turned his gaze to the provinces. For centuries, being a Roman governor was the easiest way to get rich. You went to a province, you taxed the locals into poverty, you kept chunk for yourself, and you bribed the jury when you got home. It was the accepted cycle of corruption. Domitian broke the wheel. He personally reviewed the tax records. He encouraged the provincials to sue their governors for malpractice. The historian Suetonius, who generally hated Domitian, had to grudgingly admit that under his terror-filled gaze, the administration of the empire had never been cleaner or more honest. The governors were so terrified of the man in Rome that they actually stopped stealing. However, Domitian's most significant economic move, and the one that bought him 15 years of survival, was regarding the army. Since the time of Augustus, nearly a century earlier, the pay of a Roman legionary had been frozen at 225 denarii a year. Inflation had eaten away at their earnings. The soldiers were grumbling. Domitian looked at the spreadsheets and realized a fundamental truth. You cannot be a dictator if your bodyguards are underpaid. He raised the annual par, by 33% from 225 to 300 denarii. It was the first raise the army had seen in 100 red years. The Senate was horrified. They cried that it would bankrupt the state. But Domitian didn't care about the opinions of old men in togas. He cared about the men with the swords, and he was right. The economy didn't collapse because he was so efficient at squeezing taxes and stopping corruption. He could afford to pay the troops what they deserved. The soldiers adored him. To them, he wasn't a tyrant. He was the only boss who ever gave them a fair wage. But Domitian didn't just micromanage money. He micromanaged morality. He revived the ancient office of censor for life, making him the supreme judge of Roman behavior. He looked at the loose morals of the aristocracy, the affairs, the divorces, the decadence, and decided to clean house. He enforced the Lex Scantinia and the Lex Julia on adultery with a fanatical zeal. He even kicked senators out of the Senate for acting in mimes or dancing in public. In his eyes, a Roman leader had to be serious. If you wanted to dance, do it in the circus, not in the Senate house. The darkest example of his moral crusade occurred in the year 91. Domitian decided to enforce the ancient laws regarding the Vestal virgins, the priestesses sworn to celibacy, who guarded the sacred fire of Rome. He accused the chief Vestal, Cornelia, of breaking her vows. The punishment for a Vestal who lost her virginity was horrific. She was not to be executed, but buried alive. Most emperors would have just ignored the rumor or exiled her. Domitian, the stickler for rules, followed the ancient manual to the letter. He ordered Cornelia to be taken to the evil field, Campus Sceleratus. She was given a loaf of bread, a little water, milk, and oil, and then lowered into a small underground chamber. The entrance was sealed with earth. The Emperor of Rome, the man-witch, O had balanced the budget and purified the coins, stood by and watched as a woman was entombed in darkness, all because the rules said so. This creates the complex paradox of Ditsian. From the perspective of a senator, he was a nightmare. He stripped them of power, checked their math, and judged their sex lives. He was a tyrant who treated the Senate like a room full of naughty schoolboys. But from the perspective of the empire, the shopkeeper in Gaul, the farmer in Africa, the soldier on the Danube, he was a genius. The roads were safe, the coins in their pockets were worth something, the governors didn't dare to rob them, the borders were secure. Domitian proved a dangerous historical truth. A bad man can be a good administrator. He was a political monster, but an economic savior. He ran Rome like a machine, efficiently, ruthlessly, and without a single ounce of human warmth. He made the trains run on time, as the saying goes. But God help you if you didn't have a ticket. While Dacian was busy counting coins and burying nuns in Rome, the empire had a slight problem. It was surrounded by barbarians who wanted to burn it down. A Roman emperor is judged by two things: how much grain he gives to the people, and how many foreign kings he drags through the streets, in chains. Domitian, desperate to escape the shadow of his brother Titus and his father Vespasian, needed a war. He needed a victory. He needed to prove that the pen pusher could also hold a spear. So he looked north. In the year 83, Domitian launched a campaign against the Chatti, a Germanic tribe across the Rhine. He went to the front lines himself, or at least he went near the front lines. He marched around, wore a shiny breastplate, and accepted the title Germanicus, conqueror of the Germans. The poets in Rome hailed him as a new Alexander the Great, but the reality was less Alexander and more manager. The campaign against the Chatti wasn't a glorious conquest. It was a glorified construction project. Domitian didn't just fight. He built a massive network of watchtowers, walls and forts along the frontier known as the Limes Germanicus. It was unglamorous. It was defensive, but it was brilliant. He realized Rome couldn't expand forever. It needed to lock the doors. However, while Domitian was playing soldier in Germany, a real nightmare was brewing in the Danube. A new king had risen among the Daeans, modern Daeans, modern Daeans, modern Daeans. His name was Daibalus, and he was not your average barbarian. He was smart, organized, and utterly fearless. In the year 85, Daibalus crossed the Danube and annihilated a Roman legion, killing the governor of Moesia. Domitian panicked. He sent his Praetorian prefect, a man named Cornelius Fuscus, to punish the Daean. It was a disaster. Fuscus marched his army into a trap. He was killed. His army was slaughtered, and most humiliating of all, the Daeans captured the legion's eagle standard and dragged it back to their mountain fortress. Domitian was forced to do something that made every Roman patriot vomit in their mouths. He negotiated a peace treaty. He agreed to pay Daibalus an annual subsidy, essentially protection money to stop attacking. In exchange, Daibalus agreed to be a client king. So, let's recap. The emperor of Rome was paying a barbarian king to stay home. It was a diplomatic humiliation. Yet, when Domitian returned to Rome, he celebrated a massive double triumph. He rode a chariot through the streets, claiming he had crushed the North. It was the ancient equivalent of buying the trophy at a pawn shop and telling everyone you won the Super Bowl. But while the emperor was faking glory in the capital, a general named Gnaeus Julius Agricola was achieving the real thing on the edge of the world. Agricola was the governor of Britain. He was a relic of the old school, modest, brave, and dangerously competent. While Decian was paying off Dacians, Agria was marching north into the misty highlands of Colonia, modern-day Scotland. In the year 83 or 84, Agricola faced a massive coalition of Caledonian tribes at the Battle of Mons Grappius. The historian Tacitus, who happened to be Agria's son-in-law, gives us a vivid account of this battle. Before the fight, the Caledonian leader, Calgacus, delivered one of the most blistering critiques of Roman imperialism ever written. He looked at the Roman war machine and said, "To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a desert and call it peace." It was a powerful speech, but speeches don't stop swords. Agricola crushed them. 10,000 Caledonians died. The Roman fleet sailed around the northern tip of Scotland, proving for the first time that Britain was indeed an island. Total victory was at hand. Agriola was poised to conquer the entire island, to unite Britain under Roman rule once and for all, and then he got a letter from Rome. It was from Domitian. The letter was dripping with fake praise. "Congratulations on your great victory." It essentially said, "You have done enough. Come home. I have a triumph waiting for you." Agricola knew what this meant. He wasn't being recalled because he had finished a job. He was being recalled because he was doing it too well. In the eyes of a narcissist like Domitian, a subordinate success is not an asset. It is a threat. Every time the people cheered for Agria, Domitian heard them booing him. He looked at the triumph in Scotland and didn't see a new province. He saw a potential rival emperor. The ghost of Julius Caesar, another general who conquered the north and then marched on Rome, haunted the mission's sleep. Agriola, ever the loyal soldier, obeyed. He returned to Rome in the year 85. He did not enter the city with fanfare. He entered at night quietly to avoid a crowd. He went to the palace where Dacian gave him a quick kiss on the cheek and dismissed him without a word. There was no triumph, no new command. The conqueror of Britain was forced into early retirement. Agricola spent the rest of his life in careful silence, avoiding public attention, trying to make himself look as boring and harmless as possible so the emperor wouldn't have him killed. When Agria died quietly in the year 93, rumors swirled that Domitian had poisoned him. Whether true or not, the message was clear. Under Domitian, mediocrity was safe, but excellence was a death sentence. The recall of Agria was a strategic tragedy. The Romans pulled back from Scotland. The fortress at Inchutal, which was meant to be the headquarters for the new territory, was dismantled before it was even finished. The chance to fully conquer Britain was lost forever. This is the defining flaw of Domitian's reign. He built walls on the Rhine because he understood defense, but he abandoned Scotland because he feared competition. He chose his own security over the expansion of the empire. His paranoia acted like a ceiling, capping the potential of Rome. He proved that an empire led by a jealous man is an empire that is slowly strangling itself. If the first half of Domitian's reign was a masterclass in bureaucratic efficiency, the second half was a descent into a psychological horror movie. The turning point came in January of the year 89. A governor in Upper Germany named Lucius Antonius Saturninus rebelled. He seized the savings of 2 legions and declared himself emperor. The rebellion was crushed quickly, not by Domitian, but by a loyal general who burned Saturninus's letters to protect his accomplices. But the damage was done. Domitian's worst fear had come true. The wolves were not just at the door. They were inside the house. The emperor returned to Rome, a changed man. The strict manager vanished, replaced by a paranoid hunter. He decided that if he could not trust anyone, he would have to kill everyone who might inevitably betray him. Thus began the Reign of Terror. Didion revived the most hated weapon in the imperial arsenal, the delator. These were professional informers, men who made a living by accusing their neighbors of treason. Under Domitian, this became a growth industry. The charge was always miastas, diminishing the majesty of the Roman people. The emperor. The definitions of treason became absurdly broad. Did you make a joke about the emperor's boldness? Treason. Did you undress in front of a statue of the emperor? Treason. Did you carry a map of the world in your pocket, implying you wanted to rule it? Treason. Conversation in Rome died. Dinner parties became silent affairs where guests communicated with their eyes terrified that a slave pouring wine might be a spy. The Senate House, once the stage for the greatest orators in history, became a room of trembling old men voting to execute their friends just to survive another day. The historian Tacitus wrote that they were so terrified that they lost even the memory of their voices. But the epicenter of this fear was the imperial palace itself. Domitian turned his home into a fortress of solitude. He expelled the philosophers believing that thinking was dangerous. He executed his secretaries for minor clerical errors. But his most chilling innovation was architectural. He ordered the walls of the porticos where he walked to be lined not with tapestries or paintings but with a rare, expensive stone from Cappadocia called fungate. This stone was highly polished and semi-translucent. It acted like a mirror. Imagine the emperor of the civilized world pacing the halls of his golden palace, staring not at the art but at the reflection in the walls, watching for the glint of a dagger behind his back. He lived in a house of mirrors, a prisoner of his own reflection. He couldn't relax. He couldn't sleep. He saw assassins in every shadow. To verify his power, he began to purge the Senate with a cruelty that was theatrical. He didn't just kill his enemies, he played with them. The most famous example of his psychological torture was the Black Banquet. Domitian invited the leading senators and knights to a dinner at night. When they arrived, the palace was draped in black. The food was black, the plates were black, and next to each guest's seat was a tombstone slab with their name engraved on it. For the entire meal, Domitian spoke only of death and slaughter. The guests sat in terrified silence, convinced they would be executed before dessert. Then, abruptly, Domitian dismissed them. They went home shaking, waiting for the executioner to knock on their door. Instead, a messenger arrived with a gift, the silver tombstone slab as a souvenir. It was a sick joke. Domitian was telling them, "I own your lives. I can end you whenever I want, and you will thank me for letting you live." But the terror wasn't just for show. The bodies were piling up. He executed Silvidianus Orphetus for renting out a house near the Forum to the wrong people. He executed Mettus Pompus because he had a horoscope that said he would be emperor. Domitian was trying to murder fate itself. In the year 95, the terror crossed the final line. Domitian turned on his own blood. He arrested his cousin Flavius Clemens, a mild-mannered man who was actually the father of Domitian's declared heirs. The charge was atheism and adopting Jewish customs, which many historians believe meant that Clemens had converted to Christianity or Judaism. Domitian had Clemens executed and banished his wife, Dati, to a tiny island. This was the moment of no return. By killing his own family, Domitian shattered the last layer of protection he had. If a cousin wasn't safe, then a wife wasn't safe. Then a wife wasn't safe. If a wife wasn't safe, then a servant wasn't safe. The atmosphere in the palace in 96 was suffocating. Domitian was keeping a notebook under his pillow. It was a list of names, a hit list, and every day he would cross a name off. He consulted soothsayers obsessively, desperate to know when he would die. One astrologer, Asclarian, predicted that Domitian would die very soon. Furious, Domitian asked the astrologer how he, the astrologer, would die. Asclarian replied that he would be torn apart by dogs. To prove the astrologer wrong and defy fate, Domitian ordered Asclarian to be executed immediately, and his body burned on a pea so dogs couldn't eat him. But, as the fire was lit, a sudden storm broke out. The rain extinguished the flames, and from the darkness, a pack of stray dogs emerged and tore the half-burnt corpse to pieces. When Domitian heard this, he collapsed in terror. Fate was coming for him. The mirrors couldn't save him. The armies couldn't save him. He was the most powerful man on earth, and he was completely, utterly alone. He famously said, "Io Principi, the condition of emperors is most miserable, for no one believes them when they report a conspiracy until they have been assassinated." He was right. A conspiracy was forming, but it wasn't in the Senate. It wasn't on the frontier. It was right there, reflected in the fungite walls, holding a tray of wine and a concealed dagger. The moment Domitian took his last breath on the floor of his bedroom, the Roman Senate collectively exhaled for the first time in 15 years. There was no moment of silence. There was no respectful mourning period. There was only a riot of vindictive joy. The senators who had spent a decade trembling, ingy in their togas, suddenly found their courage, now that the tyrant was dead. They rushed into the Senate House, not to legislate, but to scream insults at the empty chair where the emperor used to sit. And then they passed the ultimate sentence, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was the ancient world's version of cancelling someone, but with sledgehammers. Work crews swarmed the Forum and the Capitol like termites. They brought ladders, ropes, and iron hooks. The golden statues of Domitian, which had glittered on every corner, were pulled down with a deafening crash. The bronze was melted down, likely to mint coins for the new regime, or to make chamber pots depending on the irony of the artist. Stone reliefs were chiseled away. His name was hacked off inscriptions on temples and arches, leaving behind ugly, blank scars in the marble that you can still see in Rome today. They wanted to rewrite reality. They wanted to pretend that the last 15 years had never happened. To fill the void, the conspirators quickly pushed a man onto the throne who was the exact opposite of Domitian, His name was Marcus Coxius Nerva. He was 65 years old, childless, frail, and a career lawyer. He was chosen for one reason only. He was safe. He was the interim CEO selected to calm the shareholders. He was boring. He was weak. And most importantly, he wasn't a Flavian. But while the champagne corks were popping in the Senate, the mood in the rest of the empire was very different. This highlights the great disconnect of Roman history. The Senate hated Domitian because he took away their power and frightened them. But the Senate was a tiny club of 600 rich men. To the rest of the world, the shopkeepers, the farmers, and especially the soldiers, Domitian was a hero. The army was furious. When news of the assassination reached the camps on the Danube and the Rhine, the soldi, heirs didn't cheer. They wept. They wanted to march on Rome and crucify the assassins. To them, Domitian was the man who had raised their pay, secured the borders, and actually done the work of governing. They didn't care about the liberty of the Senate. They cared about the competence of the state. The historian Suetonius notes that the soldiers insisted on calling Domitian Dus Divine immediately after his death. It was a tense standoff. The Senate had the legal authority, but the ghost of Domitian still held the loyalty of the swords. So while the senators patted themselves on the back for restoring freedom, they were actually sitting on a powder keg. They had destroyed the statues, but they couldn't destroy the reality. The Flavians had built a machine that worked, and the Senate was just trying to figure out how to drive it, without crashing. The hatred of the elite is loud, but the gratitude of the common soldier is dangerous. And Rome was about to learn that you can erase a name from a stone, but you cannot erase it from the payroll. If you walk through the streets of Rome today, you are not walking in the city of Augustus. Nor are you walking in the city of Augustus. Nor are you walking in the city of the Flavians. Their legacy is not written on paper. It is stamped in concrete, standing defiant against the erosion of 2,000 years. First, there is the hardware. Vespasian and his sons gave the world the ultimate symbol of Roman power, the Colosseum. It was a masterstroke of populism, building a temple of entertainment on the ruins of a tyrant's vanity. It proved that Rome could take the chaos of a civil war and pour it into a mold, creating a structure so solid that even time is afraid to knock it down. Then there is the Arch of Titus standing at the entrance to the Forum. It is a beautiful monument to a brutal truth, the destruction of Jerusalem. It reminds us that glory of Rome was often paid for with the sorrows of others, but the most overlooked architectural legacy is the palace itself. Domitian the paranoid builder constructed the massive Domus Flavia on the Palatine Hill. It was so magnificent, so imposing, and so perfectly designed for the theater of power that almost every emperor after him lived there for the next 3 centuries. When we use the word palace today, it comes from the Palatine, the hill that the Flavians turned into the headquarters of the world. However, the software they installed was even more important than the hardware. The Flavians changed the operating system of the empire. Before them, being emperor was about having the right bloodline, the divine blood of Julius Caesar. Vespasian, the mule leader, proved that blood didn't matter, competence did. He opened the doors of the Senate to the provincial elites, the wealthy men from Spain, Gaul, and Africa. By letting outsiders into the club, Vespasian ensured that the empire would not die of inbreeding. He paved the way for the 5 good emperors. Trajan and Hadrian, the greatest rulers of the next century, were Spaniards. They could never have ascended the throne if Vespasian hadn't first broken the lock. And let us not forget the administrative machine. Domitian, despite his tyranny, left behind a bureaucracy that hummed with efficiency. He professionalized the civil service. He balanced the books. He created a state that could function even if the emperor was crazy. He proved that a government doesn't need to be nice to be effective. It just needs to be organized. Ultimately, the Flavian dynasty was a bridge. On one side was the madness of Nero and the anarchy of the civil war, a fire that threatened to consume everything. On the other side was the golden age of the Antonine, the era of peace and prosperity. The Flavians were he ones who crossed the chasm. They built the bridge. It wasn't a pretty bridge. It wasn't a pretty bridge. It was ugly. It was built with the rubble of Jerusalem, cemented with the blood of gladiators and guarded by the paranoia of a lonely desperate. But it was strong. It held the weight of civilization. They took a broken, bankrupt city and hammered it back into shape, handing over to the next generation a weapon that was sharpened, polished, and ready to conquer history. And that brings us to the end of our saga. What do you think? Was Didion a misunderstood genius, or a monster who got what he deserved? Did Vespasian save Rome, or did he just turn it into a family business? History is open for debate, and I want to hear your verdict in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the blood, the gold, and the concrete of the Flavian dynasty, please leave a like and share this video with a friend who appreciates the darker side of history. And make sure you are subscribed and have rung the bell, because you do not want to miss our next episode. Next time, we leave the dark corridors of Domitian's palace and march out into the open sunlight of the greatest expansion Rome ever saw. We will witness the rise of a man who was not born in Italy, to a soldier who would push the boundaries of the empire toward the Persian Gulf, and a ruler so perfect that the Senate would officially pray for later emperors to be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. Join us next time for Trajan the Optimus Prince. I am Legacy of Thrones, and remember, the stones of Rome speak, but only if you know how to listen to the blood they were built upon.